LaToya had just finished her long day at school. She worked as a teacher at a small community elementary, and her days were usually filled with the laughter of children, questions about homework, and the endless patience that only a dedicated teacher could carry. It was a Friday evening, and she was relieved that the week had finally come to an end. She stopped by a small grocery store, picked up a carton of milk, some bread and fruit, and then headed back to her car with her tote bag swinging lightly in her hand. The sun had almost set, painting the sky in orange and purple. LaToya liked driving home at this time of the day, because it gave her a chance to breathe and enjoy a moment of peace before dinner with her husband, Marcus. She unlocked her car, placed the bag on the passenger seat, and was about to turn on the radio when she noticed flashing red and blue lights behind her. At first, she thought it was just another traffic stop. She pulled over politely, thinking that maybe the police car needed to pass her. But instead, the vehicle stopped directly behind her. Two officers stepped out. Their movements were sharp and firm, as if they had already made up their minds about something. "License and registration," one of them demanded the moment he reached her window. His tone was not polite, nor was it casual, it carried suspicion. LaToya blinked in surprise. "Of course," she said softly, reaching into her purse. She handed over the documents, her hand steady, though she could already feel something unusual in the air. The officer glanced at her ID, then looked at his partner. "Matches the description," he said under his breath, but loud enough for LaToya to hear. "Description of what?" LaToya asked carefully. The second officer leaned slightly closer. "There was a report of shoplifting at the store you just came from. The suspect is a black woman wearing a dark jacket." "That's you." LaToya froze, shocked at the accusation. "That's not true," she replied calmly. "I bought groceries. You can check the receipt. I didn't steal anything." She reached for the bag beside her seat, ready to show them the items she had purchased. But before she could explain further, the first officer opened her car door. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Her heart pounded. She knew she had done nothing wrong. Every instinct told her to defend herself, to protest, but she also knew the world did not always treat her fairly when she raised her voice. She took a deep breath, slid out of the car, and stood quietly on the roadside. A few passers-by slowed down, staring curiously, some even taking out their phones to record. One of the officers took the bag from her car and peeked inside. "Groceries," he muttered, pulling out the milk and bread. "But that doesn't mean you didn't take something else." LaToya tried to remain calm. "Please, call the store manager. They can tell you I paid. I even have the receipt in my pocket." But her words fell on deaf ears. The second officer had already pulled out handcuffs. "We'll sort it out at the station," he said curtly. The cold metal closed around her wrists, and LaToya felt a sting not just on her skin, but deep inside her heart. She had spent her whole life being honest, working hard, helping children learn to read and write, and now here she was, standing on the roadside in cuffs, accused of something as petty as stealing. The crowd grew. Some whispered that it looked unfair. Others shook their heads, clearly believing the officers must have had a reason. The flashing lights reflected on the faces of strangers who would never know her story, only this moment of humiliation. As she was guided toward the police car, LaToya lifted her chin slightly. Her grandmother once told her that in moments of injustice, you either let them break your spirit or you remind yourself of who you truly are. She chose the latter. She was not guilty. She was not weak. She was a teacher, a wife, and a woman of dignity. The officers placed her in the back of the car. The door shut with a heavy thud. She stared at the metal grille between her and the front seats. It felt unreal, like she had walked into someone else's nightmare. Minutes later, as the car pulled away, she thought of Marcus. Her husband had been away on missions many times, but he always reminded her that he would protect her no matter what. He had never told her everything about his work, but she knew enough to understand that he was no ordinary soldier. Marcus was part of Delta Force, one of the most elite special operations units in the world. He was a man who had led soldiers in the most dangerous places on Earth, someone who remained calm under fire and made decisions that could save or cost lives. If Marcus knew what was happening right now, she thought, he would not be angry in the way most husbands might be. He would be controlled, strategic, calculating. He would know exactly how to handle it. But for now, Latoya was alone. At the station, she was led inside under the watchful eyes of officers and clerks. Her fingerprints were taken, though she kept reminding them she was innocent. The younger officer looked uncomfortable, almost as if he was questioning the decision, but the older one remained firm. "Procedure," he said coldly. They asked her questions. Where had she been? What did she buy? Did she see anyone suspicious in the store? Latoya answered each one clearly and without hesitation. But it was obvious they weren't listening. They had already decided she was guilty until proven innocent. As the hours dragged on, Latoya sat in a holding room with a metal chair and a table bolted to the floor. She folded her hands, her wedding ring catching the dim light. She kept imagining Marcus walking through the door. His deep, calm voice would fill the room, and the officers would finally realize what a mistake they had made. Outside the room, officers exchanged notes about the case. None of them noticed the woman sitting quietly, carrying herself with more grace than they could understand. Back home, Marcus's phone buzzed. He had been reviewing training schedules when he saw a message from a neighbor. "Marcus, I think the cops just took Latoya." She looked scared. Marcus froze, the words burning into his mind. He immediately called the police station, demanding answers. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a tone in it that would make even the hardest soldier listen. When he hung up, Marcus knew one thing: his wife had been wrongfully accused. And soon, very soon, the people responsible would realize who exactly they had put in handcuffs. For Latoya, the night felt endless. But deep down, she carried hope. Because she knew Marcus. And when Marcus came, he would not come as just her husband, he would come as the man who had faced battlefields and never lost. Marcus sat still for a long moment after ending the call with the police station. His hand was tight around the phone, knuckles pale against the black case. On the outside, he looked calm, the same calmness that years of dangerous missions had built in him. But inside, a storm was forming. His wife, the woman who had stood by him through long deployments, through nights of silence when he could not talk about what he had seen, was now sitting in a cell, accused of something that was not only false but insulting. He stood up from his chair slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow against the wall. The quiet of their home was heavy. On the table beside him, a photo of him and Latoya smiled back, taken during a rare vacation. She was laughing, her hair flying in the wind. Marcus stared at it for a second longer, letting it fuel his determination. He began moving around the house, not out of panic, but with precision. He collected the documents he might need, checked his wallet, and slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. He did not rush. Marcus had learned long ago that haste was the enemy of clarity. Every action must be thought out, deliberate, like planning an operation. Before leaving, he called a trusted friend in the military. "I need information," he said quietly. "A police station just picked up my wife. They claim she was involved in shoplifting. I want you to pull up anything you can on their procedures, the officers on duty tonight, and the chief. I'll owe you one." The friend did not ask questions. In their line of work, trust was everything. "Consider it done," came the reply. Marcus stepped outside. The evening air was cooler now, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. As he got into his car, he felt his training guide him. This was not a battlefield, but it required the same mindset: patience, awareness, and strategy. He drove toward the station, each passing block measured and calm, though his heart tightened each time he thought of Latoya sitting alone under fluorescent lights. At the station, Latoya was enduring her second round of questioning. She had repeated herself again and again, explaining what she had bought, how she had paid, even describing the cashier who had smiled and thanked her. Still, the officer across the table scribbled notes without looking at her, as if waiting for her to slip up. Latoya folded her arms, frustration simmering under her calm tone. "You can check the cameras. That will show you everything." The younger officer, who had been silent most of the time, shifted uncomfortably. He whispered something to his partner, but the older one waved him off. "We'll get to that," he said in a flat voice. She exhaled slowly. She had been married to Marcus long enough to know what he would say if he were here: "Control yourself. Do not let them see your anger. That's when they win." She sat back, her eyes steady, her spirit refusing to break. Back on the road, Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from his military friend appeared. "Chief Raymond is running the shift. 2 officers made the arrest, Officer Trent and Officer Miller. Both have minor complaints in the past for rushing stops. Nothing official stuck. Watch them." Marcus memorized the names. His mind clicked into place the way it always did when planning a mission. First step: gather information. Second: analyze weakness. Third: execute with precision. When he reached the station, he parked quietly and sat for a moment. He didn't storm in. That was not his way. Instead, he watched. Through the glass doors, he saw officers moving about, some laughing, some buried in paperwork. He walked in, tall and steady, dressed not in uniform but in civilian clothes that could not hide his bearing. Heads turned slightly. There was something in the way he carried himself like a man who belonged in command. At the front desk, a clerk looked up. "Can I help you?" "My wife was brought in tonight," Marcus said calmly. "Latoya. I'd like to know why she's here." The clerk tapped the computer, then frowned. "She's in holding. Shoplifting charge." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "That's a mistake. I'd like to see her." The clerk hesitated, glancing at the officers nearby. "You'll need to wait until the officers are done questioning." Marcus leaned slightly closer, his eyes firm but polite. "Bring the chief. I'll speak to him directly." The clerk swallowed, then nodded quickly. Moments later, Chief Raymond appeared, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a heavy step. He looked at Marcus with mild irritation, as if expecting an argument. "Your wife is being processed," the chief said. "You'll have to be patient." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "My wife is innocent. I want to see the evidence you have before you drag her name through the dirt." The chief bristled. "We have officers who identified her as matching the suspect." "Then show me the footage," Marcus replied, his tone calm, yet leaving no room for refusal. The chief paused, studying Marcus. There was something unsettling about the man before him. He wasn't shouting, wasn't pleading. He was too steady, too controlled, as if he knew exactly how this would end. Latoya, meanwhile, sat in the holding room, unaware that Marcus had already arrived. She closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer. She imagined him walking through the doors, and it gave her strength. Back outside the room, Marcus remained silent as the chief reluctantly called for the store footage to be pulled. The officers who had arrested Latoya, Trent, and Miller, arrived to explain their side. "She matched the description," Trent insisted. "Dark jacket, same build, same hair." Marcus turned his head slightly toward them. "Did you bother to check the receipt she offered you?" The younger officer, Miller, shifted uncomfortably. She did mention one, sir. Trent frowned at his partner but said nothing. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in sharp focus. He recognized the pattern: overconfidence mixed with carelessness. He had seen it in rookie soldiers who thought they could win a fight by rushing in. Within minutes, the footage appeared on a monitor. Marcus stepped forward, arms crossed, watching closely. The video showed LaToya walking into the store, selecting groceries, paying at the counter, and walking out with a bag in her hand. There was no hesitation, no theft, nothing suspicious. Silence filled the room. Marcus looked directly at the chief. "This is your evidence," he said evenly. "Do you still plan to keep her locked up?" The chief cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "It appears there's been a mistake." Marcus's expression did not change. Inside, his fury burned, but he controlled it the way he always had. Discipline first, reaction second. He knew there was a time to reveal who he truly was, but for now, he kept it in his pocket like a hidden card. As LaToya was finally told she would be released, Marcus waited at the desk, still as a statue. The officers whispered to each other, trying to figure out who this man was that carried such quiet authority. They would soon learn. For Marcus, this was only the beginning. Clearing LaToya's name was one step. Making sure those responsible were held accountable was the next. And when the moment came, the truth about who he was would shake the station in a way they had never expected. The air in the police station felt heavier as Marcus stood near the desk, waiting. LaToya, still in the holding room, had not yet seen him, but she could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Something felt different, like a calm before a storm. She clasped her hands together, repeating to herself that Marcus would come, and when he did, everything would change. Inside the viewing room, the chief and the arresting officers shifted nervously. The footage from the store was playing again, frame by frame. There was LaToya, carrying her tote bag, selecting milk, fruit, and bread. Then, at the counter, the cashier smiled, handed her the receipt, and she walked out without hesitation. Every second of the video made the arrest look weaker and weaker. Marcus watched without moving, his arms folded across his chest. He didn't need to say anything, the evidence was speaking louder than words. Still, the officers looked anywhere but at him, embarrassed by the mistake they had made. Chief Raymond cleared his throat. "Well, it seems the evidence doesn't support the charge. She'll be released immediately." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes steady on the chief. "Released is not enough. You dragged her from her car in front of strangers. You handcuffed her without checking the facts. You put her in a cell. Who is going to explain that to her?" The room grew silent. Marcus wasn't shouting. He wasn't even raising his voice. But the weight of his words pressed down harder than anger ever could. The chief shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Finally, Marcus exhaled slowly. "Take me to her." The officers exchanged glances. The chief gave a reluctant nod, and Miller, the younger officer, walked Marcus to the holding room. Miller kept glancing sideways at Marcus as they walked down the hall. He wanted to ask who this man really was, but something about Marcus's silent strength stopped him. When the door opened, LaToya looked up. The moment her eyes met Marcus's, relief washed over her. She stood quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. Marcus stepped in, his calm face softening as he reached her. He didn't need words. His presence was enough. LaToya smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Marcus touched her arm gently, the only reassurance she needed. Then he turned to the officer standing at the door. "Remove the cuffs," he said firmly. The officer hesitated, but Marcus's tone left no room for argument. The handcuffs were unlocked, and LaToya rubbed her wrists, the faint marks visible against her skin. Marcus saw them and felt a quiet rage inside, but he held it back. Now was not the time. Together, they walked out of the room. The station had grown quieter, as though everyone was aware of the storm brewing beneath Marcus's calm surface. Officers who had been laughing earlier now stood straighter, watching the couple pass. Latoya walked with dignity, holding her head high, but Marcus could feel the weight of her humiliation in each step. At the desk, the chief tried to smooth things over. "Mrs. Johnson, we apologize for the inconvenience. There was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Latoya looked at him, her voice calm but steady. "This wasn't an inconvenience. This was a mistake that could have ruined my reputation. You didn't even listen to me." Her words struck harder than any argument Marcus could have made. The chief shifted uncomfortably again, mumbling something about reviewing procedures. Marcus placed a hand on Latoya's shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. But before they left, he stopped and turned back. His eyes locked on officers Trent and Miller, who stood near the wall. Trent avoided his gaze, while Miller looked uneasy. "You two arrested her," Marcus said evenly. "Next time, you might want to ask questions before putting someone in cuffs." Trent's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Miller nodded quickly, murmuring, "Yes, sir." Marcus held his stare for a moment longer, then turned back to the door. Outside, the night air felt cooler, fresher. Latoya inhaled deeply, grateful to be free, but the sting of what had happened still lingered. She looked up at Marcus as they walked to the car. "They didn't believe me. No matter what I said, they had already decided I was guilty." Marcus opened the car door for her. "They'll believe you now," he said quietly. His voice carried a weight that made her pause. She knew what he meant. Marcus wasn't done. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past the windows. Latoya leaned back, tired, her eyes closing for a moment. "What did you say to them?" she asked softly. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. "I didn't have to say much. The truth was enough." But inside, he was already thinking ahead. The system had failed Latoya tonight, and Marcus knew better than anyone that failure in critical moments could destroy lives. He couldn't let this pass without consequence. He wasn't seeking revenge. What he wanted was change, accountability, respect, and fairness. As they neared home, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was his military contact. The message was short but sharp: "Saw the footage. They were careless." Words already spreading. Marcus put the phone down without replying. He didn't need gossip. He needed results. Later that night, after Latoya had gone to bed, Marcus sat in his study. The room was dark except for a small lamp on the desk. He opened his laptop and began typing notes. Names, times, details, everything he had observed at the station. His training had taught him to document everything, to see patterns, to identify weaknesses. This was no different from preparing a mission. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He had kept his identity quiet so far. None of the officers knew who he really was. To them, he was just a tall, calm husband who spoke with unusual authority. But Marcus knew there might come a moment when the truth of his position would have to be revealed. When that time came, they would realize they had not just humiliated a teacher, they had insulted the wife of a man who had given his life to defending the very freedoms they claimed to uphold. For now, he would wait. He would watch. And when the time was right, he would make sure the department remembered this night not as a mistake they brushed aside, but as a turning point. Latoya stirred in her sleep, and Marcus glanced toward the bedroom door. His expression softened. She was strong, stronger than most realized. She had endured humiliation and still walked out with dignity. He admired her resilience, but he also knew it was his duty to make sure she never faced something like this again. In the quiet of the night, Marcus closed his laptop and whispered to himself, they'll know soon enough who they put in handcuffs. The following morning, the police station buzzed with quiet tension. Word of the mistake had already begun to spread. Officers who had not been involved in the arrest whispered about how quickly the situation had shifted once Marcus arrived. Some were embarrassed, some defensive, and others simply curious. Who was that man? He wasn't loud, he wasn't threatening, but somehow he carried an authority that silenced the entire room. Marcus, however, was not finished. He had let them correct their mistake, but he knew that without accountability, the same thing would happen to another innocent person. LaToya had been treated as if her dignity didn't matter. That was something Marcus could not accept. That morning, he called a trusted contact within the Pentagon. He rarely used his influence for personal matters, but this was different. "I need a background check on Chief Raymond," Marcus said firmly. "Also, I want records of complaints filed against officers Trent and Miller. Keep it discreet." The contact hesitated for only a second. "Understood." Meanwhile, LaToya tried to continue with her normal routine. She prepared breakfast, watered the plants near the window, and attempted to focus on lesson plans for her students. But no matter how much she tried, the memory of being handcuffed lingered. It wasn't just about her. It was about the message it sent that someone's word, someone's innocence, could be dismissed so easily. When Marcus joined her at the table, she looked at him quietly. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she asked. He set his coffee mug down. "Would you want me to?" She shook her head slowly. "No. But I know you, Marcus. When you decide to fight, you don't stop until the battle is over." He reached across the table, holding her hand gently. "This isn't just about you. It's about making sure they don't do this to someone else. If they can treat you this way, they'll do it again. Next time it might be worse." Later that day, Marcus returned to the station not in anger, but with a purpose. When he walked in, the same officers straightened unconsciously, as if responding to a commanding officer. Chief Raymond appeared, clearly uncomfortable to see him again. "Mr. Johnson," the chief began, trying to sound cordial. "I thought we resolved everything last night. Your wife has been cleared." Marcus nodded slightly. "She's cleared, yes. But you haven't addressed how you got to that point. Why did your officers arrest her without checking facts? Why wasn't she given the chance to show her receipt?" The chief shifted. "Mistakes happen. We're reviewing procedures." Marcus stepped closer, his voice still calm but sharp as steel. "Mistakes in war cost lives. Mistakes in law enforcement cost trust. Do you understand the weight of that?" The chief blinked, taken aback by the precision of Marcus's words. "Who exactly are you?" he asked finally. For the first time, Marcus allowed a small smile to touch his lips. He pulled out a small leather wallet from his jacket and opened it, revealing his identification. The badge and clearance spoke louder than anything he could have said. The room fell silent. Officers who caught a glimpse of it stiffened, their expressions changing instantly. "I am Commander Marcus Johnson, United States Army Delta Force," he said evenly. "I have led men into battles you will never read about in your newspapers. I have stood in places where one wrong decision would end everything. And last night, I saw your men make decisions without discipline, without care, and without respect for the truth." The chief swallowed hard. The weight of the revelation hit everyone in the room. Delta Force was not just another unit, it was the elite of the elite, a name spoken with reverence even in military circles. To have arrested the wife of such a man, and without cause, was not just a mistake. It was a disgrace. Trent, the officer who had cuffed LaToya, looked pale. Miller stared at the ground, shame heavy on his face. Marcus's eyes moved slowly across the room, locking on each of them. "When you wear that badge, you carry more than authority. You carry responsibility. You don't get to guess. You don't get to act on assumptions. Because when you do, innocent people suffer. The silence stretched for several long seconds. No one dared to speak. Marcus stepped back, his voice lowering but still sharp. You will correct this. You will change how you handle stops and arrests. Because if you don't, this station will answer not just to me, but to higher authorities who will not be forgiving. The chief nodded quickly, his earlier pride replaced by unease. Yes, Commander. We'll take action. Marcus gave a final nod, then turned and walked out of the station. The officers exhaled slowly, as though the air had only just returned. Outside, Latoya was waiting for him in the car. She looked at him curiously when he slid into the driver's seat. What did you say to them? Marcus started the engine, his face calm. I told them the truth. She tilted her head. And the truth is that they need to change, or they'll answer to people far above their rank, Marcus said simply. On the drive home, Latoya studied him quietly. She had always known her husband carried a weight from his years of service, but today she saw it differently. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who carried discipline like a second skin, who could turn quiet words into commands no one dared ignore. That evening, news quietly began to spread through unofficial channels. Officers who had been present told others about what had happened. Some spoke about the mistake with embarrassment, others with relief that it hadn't escalated further. But what stuck with everyone was the moment Marcus revealed who he truly was. They knew then that the man they had dismissed as just another angry husband was someone whose authority reached far beyond their walls. At home, Marcus and Latoya sat together in the living room. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. Do you think they'll really change? She asked softly. Marcus looked ahead, his eyes thoughtful. Maybe. Fear can make people change for a while. But real respect lasts longer. That's what I tried to give them. The rest is up to them. Latoya smiled faintly, comforted by his words. She closed her eyes, feeling safe at last. Marcus wrapped his arm around her, his grip protective yet gentle. In that quiet moment, she realized something powerful. Her husband wasn't just her protector. He was a man who could turn an injustice into a lesson, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. And deep down, Marcus knew this wasn't the end. The incident might fade from public eyes, but for him and Latoya, it would remain a reminder of how fragile dignity could be, and how vital it was to guard it. The days that followed moved slowly, yet each one carried the weight of what had happened. Latoya returned to her work at the school, smiling for the children and answering their endless questions, but inside she carried the memory of the night she was handcuffed. Every time she passed a police car on her way home, she felt a flicker of unease, a reminder that trust could be broken so easily. She refused to let it show, but Marcus saw it. He noticed the way her hands tightened on the steering wheel when sirens passed by, the way her eyes avoided the officers on the street. He noticed everything. Marcus himself had not spoken much about it since his confrontation at the station. He had revealed who he was, made his expectations clear, and then returned home to his life. But silence did not mean he was done. His way was never to act recklessly. He preferred to wait, to watch what people did after they had been warned. One afternoon, a letter arrived at their house. It was from the police department. The chief had written a formal apology, acknowledging the mistake and assuring them that changes were being made to prevent such incidents from happening again. There were words about new training sessions, revised procedures, and accountability. Latoya read the letter aloud, her voice calm. When she finished, she looked at Marcus. Do you believe them? Marcus leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. Belief is earned. They'll prove it, not with words, but with actions. Time will show if they mean what they wrote. Latoya nodded, folding the letter neatly. She wanted to believe it was true. She wanted to believe that her pain had at least pushed others to change for the better. Meanwhile, inside the station, things were indeed shifting. Officers Trent and Miller were called into meetings where their actions were reviewed carefully. Trent bristled at the criticism, muttering that he had only followed his instincts. But the chief, still shaken by Marcus's words, reminded him sharply that instincts were not enough, that discipline, evidence, and fairness had to come first. Miller, on the other hand, listened quietly, shame written on his face. For the first time, he admitted that maybe they had acted too quickly, too harshly. The department began holding new sessions on how to handle stops and arrests. They spoke about bias, about patience, about listening before acting. Some officers rolled their eyes, but others understood that this was no small matter. The story of LaToya's arrest had not been printed in newspapers, but inside the station, it was told again and again. And every time, the part that carried the most weight was not the mistake itself, but the revelation of who Marcus truly was. For LaToya, the healing came slowly. One evening, she and Marcus walked through the park near their home. The sun was setting, the sky a soft gold. Families were out, children running, laughter floating in the air. LaToya held Marcus's hand as they strolled down the path. "I still think about it," she admitted softly. "I close my eyes and see their faces when they put the cuffs on me. I hear the voices of people watching, wondering if I had done something wrong. I know I'm free now, but the memory stays." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Memories fade, but strength grows. You carried yourself with dignity, even when they tried to take it away. That is what will last. Not their mistake, but your strength." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "You always know what to say." He smiled faintly. "I know what I've seen. And what I saw that night was a woman who stood taller than any accusation." As they sat on a bench, Marcus thought about all the missions he had been on. He had faced enemy fire, led men through impossible odds, and survived moments where fear could have broken anyone. Yet when he thought of LaToya sitting in that cold room, speaking calmly to officers who would not listen, he realized her courage was just as great as his own. Back at the station, Chief Raymond called a final meeting with his staff. He reminded them of the incident, not to shame them, but to make it clear that mistakes like that carried consequences far beyond the walls of the station. "We were lucky this time," he said firmly. "Lucky that Mrs. Johnson was calm. Lucky that her husband sought justice without anger. But next time, we may not be so lucky. Do not let it happen again." The officers listened, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. The message was clear. They had been given a chance to learn, and they would be judged by what they did from here on. Weeks later, LaToya began to notice small differences. A neighbor mentioned that when she was stopped for a broken tail light, the officer had spoken politely, explained everything clearly, and let her go with a warning. A student's parent told her that when he was questioned about a misunderstanding at a store, the officers listened carefully before making any decision. These were small changes, but they were signs that something was shifting. One evening, Marcus returned home later than usual. LaToya greeted him at the door, and he handed her a folded paper. "What's this?" she asked curiously. "An internal memo," he replied. "A friend sent it to me. It's about the new training program at the station. They put it in place permanently. The focus is on fairness, on reviewing evidence before action. Your case was the example used." LaToya unfolded the paper and read it silently. Her chest felt heavy with emotion. She had not wanted to be anyone's example. She had only wanted to be treated fairly. But if her pain meant others would be spared, then perhaps it carried a purpose. She looked up at Marcus, tears in her eyes. "You did this." He shook his head gently. "No. You did. You stood with dignity. I only reminded them of their duty. Latoya stepped closer, resting her head against his chest. His steady heartbeat was the sound of home, the sound of safety. In that moment, she realized that her husband's strength was not just in his training, his rank, or his command. It was in his ability to turn pain into power, to take injustice and turn it into change. From that day on, the shadow of that night began to fade. It would never disappear completely, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it became a story she could carry, a story of injustice, yes, but also of courage, dignity, and love. When people in their community spoke about the Johnsons, they spoke not only of the mistake that had been made, but of the way it ended. They spoke of the calm strength of a teacher who refused to be broken, and the quiet power of a commander who reminded a police station what justice truly meant. And in the privacy of their home, Marcus and Latoya continued their lives together, stronger than before. They knew the world was not perfect, but they also knew that with patience, discipline, and truth, change was possible. For Latoya, every day she stepped into her classroom, she carried that lesson with her. She taught her students not only reading and writing, but also courage and fairness. For Marcus, every time he looked at her, he was reminded that battles were not always fought on foreign soil. Sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones fought quietly, in the heart of a city, where dignity itself was on the line. And together, they walked forward hand in hand, unshaken, and unbroken.